Welcome to the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. Each week, this webinar series features an extraordinary individual that provides valuable and impactful services, helping to transform the capabilities of their nonprofit clients. Join us as we explore a variety of topics, all vital to the success of nonprofit organizations. Learn and grow from the experience and expertise of our featured guests. Without further delay, let's introduce you to the host of the Nonprofit Edge podcast series, Chris Looney.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Edge podcast, a podcast to promote purpose and practice. Each episode features an extraordinary individual who brings insight, expertise, and practical tools that help nonprofit leaders strengthen their organizations and increase their impact. Our goal is simple: to explore ideas and experiences that help nonprofit professionals become stronger leaders and more effective stewards of the missions they serve. We're grateful you've joined us for today's conversation, and I'm super excited to welcome Stephanie Freeth, a leadership coach and advisor who helps organizations develop courageous leaders and healthy, high-performing teams. Stephanie focuses on helping leaders understand the behaviors and dynamics that either strengthen teams or quietly undermine them. A large part of her work centers on one of the most important transitions in a professional career: the move from being an individual contributor to becoming a manager. And that transition can be exciting, but it can also be challenging. And many new managers discover very quickly that the skills that help them succeed as individual performers are not always the same skills required to lead effectively. So today we're going to explore the 5 biggest mistakes new managers often make during their first 6 months in leadership roles. We'll probably discover a few others to share with you as well. But more importantly, how leaders can avoid those mistakes and set their teams up for success. Stephanie, welcome to the show. We're so glad you've joined us.
Thanks, Chris. So happy that you reached out and really happy to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. I was telling you earlier that I get excited about these conversations because I learn, and I'm excited for the audience to learn, but I'm excited for me personally to learn because we're also simultaneously doing some education on emerging leaders, and I think this is going to really help me as much as everybody else that listens. So let's start first with a little bit of background so people can get to know you before we dive into the topic of new managers. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your professional journey and how you came to focus your work on leadership development and team dynamics?
Great. Yeah, this is a bit of a winding path, but I've always cared about causes. I grew up in a family of educators, and so it was always about how can we help, what can we do, how do we learn throughout life. And so I worked in a lot of nonprofits for a long time. Coming out of Princeton, I worked for a nonprofit fellowship where I got exposure to all the different aspects of nonprofit management, ended up getting an MBA. So most of my career, I've worked either in the nonprofit sector and mostly those were in like fundraising and revenue roles, but I've also done strategic planning with nonprofits as a consultant and as a coach. And a lot of my current clients are nonprofits. So I see the realities of what people are facing on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of times when you do strategy work, you very quickly surface the fundamental human dynamics that are part of a strategic conversation. And so I've been drawn more and more over the years to look at, I always say the inner game runs the outer game. And so we really have to get in touch with ourselves as leaders and making that transition from an individual contributor to a manager. That's really the tipping point where it becomes so much more important to learn how to navigate those relational dynamics and to impact performance as well.
I got goosebumps when you said the inner game runs the outer game, because that's just such a cool concept. I want to unpack that. I wish we had another hour just to focus on that. You're so smart, so experienced. I know your clients are super lucky to be working with you. So let's dig in further and talk a little bit about in your experience with working with these organizations and your clients, why is the transition from individual contributor to manager often more difficult than people expect.
Yeah, great. So this is a great place to start. So I think it has to do with a couple things. First of all, it's scope, because when you're an individual contributor, you have your defined set of here's what I need to do my job. These are the tasks I need to do. When you become a manager, you switch from tasks into influence. You switch from what's on your to-do list to how do I move the needle relationally? How do I work through others rather than me being the one to control everything? So it's really that shifting point of how do I step into influencing others and not just getting the task done?
Yeah, amazing. And what are some of the early warning signs that a new manager may be struggling in that transition?
Yeah. So I think part of human behavior is we think everybody sees the world the same way we do. And that's just not true. So a new manager might think, I don't understand why this person on my team is doing this because we're using our own filter to against their behavior. And as I've worked with teams and looking for different tools, I'm one of those like framework and tool junkies. I'll go and try to find all these different ways. And some of the most elegant things I found have been around a body of work called conscious leadership. And then there's something called the Enneagram, which is a very ancient tool. It sits, if you look at different personality tools, Myers-Briggs, Strength Finder, DISC, Colby, Predictive Index, all of those. The reason I like the Enneagram is because it looks at the underlying motivation of why do we do what we do. So bringing this back to new managers, there are 9 human archetypal patterns within the Enneagram. And if we all have our own filter. And so if I am a 3, which is the competitive achiever, and I'm focused on tasks, but my person I'm managing is a 7, and that's the enthusiastic visionary, and their filter is around how can we do this better? And they don't want to touch into negative aspects. Then when the filter isn't apparent, human behavior becomes really confusing. And so a lot of times when I'm working with new managers, I will recommend using the Enneagram to first diagnose, what are my own motivations? Why do I do what I do? What do my patterns look like when I'm healthy? What do my patterns look like when I'm constricted? What's my action style? What's my thinking style? What's my way of processing emotions? Because when you start with self-awareness and you know how you show up, and then when you map that with the rest of your team, then you can really see how is this particular set of people who are working together, how are they triggering each other? How are they supporting each other? How are they what do they look like as a system? And this is an underlying diagnostic piece that most people don't even know you can do this. And yet I've found, particularly when someone is stepping into a role as a new manager, if they want to get up to speed quickly and understand their team dynamics in a very deep and enduring way, using a tool like the Enneagram can help them map the system. Because otherwise, when we're just going by experience, it takes us a long time to map that system and map the relational dynamics behind the system.
Yeah, yeah. So when's the right time to do some of this diagnostic work? Is it before you step into the job? Is it in your first 60 days? Like
Yeah.
how would a new manager take advantage of something like this?
I mean, this can range. I think sometimes it depends on if you're coming in from the outside and you're a new manager and there's new teams. And sometimes there's people who have been on that team for a long time. Sometimes there's brand new people. I have a client where it was a sales team and they were hiring a lot of people. This person was highly focused on relational dynamics, which was great. So she sought me out. She wanted to do it early on. She knew about the Enneagram and she wanted to bring that in at the very start of her work with her team. I've seen other managers who've been there for about a year or so, and they hit some roadblocks and they hit some friction points. So sometimes it can be a reset where it's like, okay, we're having these conflicts, we're having some dynamics that aren't quite as smooth as they could be. Let's go another level deeper, because it's all about trust, and it's all about being willing to see patterns at this deeper level. And sometimes, depending on the person's experience level, and if they're a brand new manager, they might need to handle the kind of the tactical elements of the job first. before they then go deeper. So it really kind of depends on the situation. So I like to listen when I talk to new teams and determine
Yeah.
the timing of that.
Yeah. Yeah. But you would recommend some element of sort of discovery before a new manager really kind of gets too far into the work.
Yeah, sure. With even within a couple months, perhaps starting off fresh, and then you have a chance to shape the patterns intentionally rather than just reacting to them under
Very
pressure.
good. Love it. Love it. Well, I feel like we already started getting into the core topic of the five biggest mistakes new managers make.
Yeah.
But let's press on and really tackle mistake number one, if you will. Um, the mistake that you often highlight is relying too heavily on the skills that earned that person their promotion in the first place. And I wanted to know why is that such a common trap?
Mhm. It's human nature. We operate by using our past experience, and our brains will sort things based on our past experience. It happens very automatically in our physiology. And we think, hey, I just got rewarded by doing these things. So now if I just
Right.
double down and keep doing more of them, I'll be great. And
Right.
that often, because of that switch from task orientation into relational influence, the same things that are checking things off your to-do list, it's not the same with dealing with humans. You've got to have an initial conversation, and then you have to, like, it's a different rhythm and cadence for how you work with people relationally, how you build trust. And so sometimes if people just try to focus on the tasks at first, like, let's go, here's what we got to do, they're going to be relational speed bumps that are going to come out at some point. But sometimes you can't, even when I say these are mistakes that new managers make, um, that's not meant to be blaming. It's meant to indicate this is a new territory. And so sometimes we need to start working within that new territory to realize, like, oh, that's not working. Sometimes that experience is just as valuable to then give us a reason to say, I've got to do this differently. And I can't just double down on doing the same things that I was doing before I started this role.
So I wanted to ask like the mindset shift that needs to happen when someone moves from doing the work to leading the work. And one of the things that I would imagine would be the challenge or a challenge among them is thinking, well, this is the way I did it, so this is the way you have to do it to be successful, right? What
Yeah.
else what other mind shifts exist?
Yeah, so that's a great one because, again, we're relying on experience. I think the other one is sometimes people are really afraid to fail and they're afraid to experiment. And the most successful leaders I see are willing to experiment. They're willing to try things out. They're willing to say, will this work? And because sometimes we can, and this also varies based on Enneagram type. So I think in terms of the patterns, but I think new leaders need to learn to, there's a phrase in adaptive leadership work called getting on the balcony. And so instead of being on the dance floor and in the dance, which you are
Yeah.
as a worker, as a leader, you need to be able to get on the balcony and see the system
Wow.
and
Interesting.
see the moves happening so that you can anticipate what's coming, what do we need to respond to. And so it's kind of up leveling that bird's eye view of seeing the team as a system.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think some people would imagine that being on the balcony is appropriate so people can hear what you're trying to say, right?
Mm.
It like the Pope, right? Let me preach. But actually, it's this concept of it gives you a better vantage point to see what's actually going on. So you just opened my mind to like a different visual concept around leadership.
Yeah, and I think new managers can think like, "Oh, I have to have all the answers now." And you don't. And so listening becomes a huge skill for new managers to listen before getting on the balcony and speaking. Like, you might need to take some things in before you just go up there and, speak.
Great. That's great. Well, how can
Yeah.
new managers recognize when they're slipping back into individual contributor mode rather than developing as leaders?
Yeah, I recommend this for all teams, but learning to get comfortable with feedback and to invite feedback in real time is really important. And not just from the manager and the leader down to their team, 360-degree feedback. And creating an environment where that type of productive feedback can happen in real time rather than like holding it for a year in a performance review or stuffing it and never saying it or and letting resentment build if something isn't working. So I think when leaders go in and have this because presence is it becomes another skill. It's not just what we're doing, it's who we're being. So developing a leadership presence where you are open to feedback, where you're saying like, I'd love to hear from you, how did that go, and having that two-way dialogue with your team so that because the higher up you go in leadership, sometimes the less feedback you get because there's that power dynamic and people feel like
Right.
I can't give feedback to my leader. But really good leaders who are often in that servant leadership type of mentality and role want to listen. They want to hear from who they're leading. They want to take all of that into consideration.
That's great. That's great. All right, so we're going to jump into mistake number two. And the way that I've listed it here is a lack of clarity around what actually drives results. And many new managers find themselves obviously very extremely busy, but not always effective. And why does that happen?
Yeah. So there's so many different ways we could take this one. One thing I want to focus on is, what are you measuring? What are the goals? What are the objectives? But also looking at lagging versus leading indicators. What can you
Okay.
control? What can you control? What can you not control? So, for example, if you were leading a fundraising team, you can't control the dollars that come in, but you can control the number of visits that you're doing to see donors one on one.
Yeah.
And so that's a leading indicator. If you have 90 visits in a quarter versus 20 visits in a quarter, most likely your outcomes are going to be stronger when your intentional activities has been higher. So sometimes it's what are we measuring? What's important? I've seen some teams try to measure too many things. So picking what are our clear indicators? And in nonprofits, those can be a variety of things. So this can get specific based on the industry, based on what they're trying to do, but really having clear metrics around where's the team going and also who's owning those metrics. Sometimes it's unclear whether this team member is driving that, who has the decision rights to drive that metric and to own it. So some of that definition is really important when a team is first getting set up. I don't know if you're familiar with the four stages of team development: the forming, storming,
Of course
norming.
I am. No,
Yeah. Okay.
no,
So,
no.
so there's a
Go
guy
ahead.
named there's a guy named Tuckman, and he has a model. And so there's the forming, and then there's what's called storming, norming, and then performing.
Oh, interesting. I
So
love it.
sometimes when a team is new, you're in the forming. So if you are intentional about how it's being formed, that helps. But a lot of times then you move into the storming phase where that's the conflict. It's like we're working things out, we're getting used to
Hmm.
each other, we're setting these metrics, we're deciding how we define progress, and then forming, storming. Okay, and then to norming. You get to the norming to say this is how we do things, and then you hit the performing stage. But sometimes teams get stuck in any one of those areas,
Yeah,
cycle
right.
back through if new people come in. So I think the more intentional new leaders can be of just knowing that, hey, you might have some storming along the way,
Yeah.
and as you're moving through these phases, there are ways to work through them in order to set your team up for success.
Yeah, love it. Is there a particular way that new managers can more quickly determine what drives those results for a team? How do you help a manager understand what it is that they should be measuring or the kinds of results they should be
Yeah.
seeking?
I think some of that's in the realm of the strategic planning work that I do with organizations, because you really want to tie it to what's the company trying to achieve? What's the mission? What's the vision? What's the purpose? Are you trying to end homelessness? Are you trying to impact something in healthcare? So really driving all the team metrics from the organizational vision. And
Okay.
sometimes you've got sometimes organizations do a really good job of setting out mission, vision, values. These are the objectives in this year. These are the quarterly objectives. So sometimes managers are operating within a system that's done that well. And sometimes they're operating in systems that haven't set those at the highest level. So then they're left trying to figure them out, which isn't always fair. So a lot of times I'm trying to support organizations in setting that vision from the top so that it's all about alignment. And that you're really staying focused on what's the mission, what's the vision, how do we measure that? Is it lives impacted? What's our theory of change? How are we doing this? So this one, it kind of depends on the specific company, but I see patterns based on the work that an overall organization has done and then how the manager's fitting within that system.
Great. Are there particular habits that help leaders translate strategy into clear priorities? Are there sort of recommendations that you make in terms of how leaders should show up or what they should be really focused on and doing?
So one thing I think that is important to define is the so that. So when you're setting a goal, it's like, we have this goal so that what? What gets impacted? Because sometimes we'll set a goal, we'll be like, we're going to raise $3 million this year. Well, so that what? So that we can reduce the rate of homelessness in our community by 50%. So making sure to outline the so that, why are we doing this, becomes a lot easier than just a random goal of why are we raising this money or why are we doing that thing. So some of it is at that strategic level. In terms of habits, a lot of it goes back to self-awareness and being able to understand, how am I showing up? What does it look like when I'm triggered? Do I have a regulated nervous system even? And this is a conversation we often don't have in organizations, but the more I have found in my career and as I work with leaders and teams, the more we learn to regulate our own nervous system, the less reactive we get in a tense meeting, or we start to question our assumptions. We might not just be like, well, that person, we don't make up stories. That person did this to me and I'm mad at them and I'm going to get inflamed and reactive. We learn to slow down, pause, separate facts from stories. What are the things the video camera could record? What's everything else I make up about that? And then we hold, hey, I'm making this up. I don't know if this is true or not, but these are the stories that I'm making up. So there's a lot of different tools that as I'm working with organizations, we're bringing to teams to help them handle the perception issues in organizations that are often, again, they like fundamentally our nervous system is underpinning the way we show up in the world.
Yeah, I want to figure out how to write an opinion piece on managing one's nervous system.
We can co-author it. Let's work on that.
Yeah, I like it. I like it because it's almost one of those offensive topics. Like, how dare you uh, kind of suggest that I need to work on, my reactions to things. And that's hard, right? Because no one wants to feel like they're reacting or responding inappropriately to certain stimulus. And the reality is, it's probably very true that many
Well,
people do.
yeah, if you think about leadership presence, what that means is, what's the energy that I'm carrying into a room? And if I'm dysregulated and I'm reactive because of something that I heard before I walked into the room, I can't be fully present with everything that's happening. Because when we learn how to center ourselves and learn how to breathe and focus and not get hooked by a comment. So we get reactive when there's something that hooks us. So when somebody says something, if it touches a sore spot inside of us, I call that a hook. It's kind of like Velcro. it often points back to something that I have unresolved within myself. It's a mirror. And after I've worked through those things, and there's a variety of ways to do that, it's almost like that comment can go right through, but the hook is gone. And so I stay regulated. I don't need to be like, blah, that person said this, and rah, like I don't have to have that physiological response to get immediately triggered and offended. But it's long-term work. It's dedicated work. You have to work on it, not just mentally, but physiologically, somatically, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. The modern day, don't get rage baited or whatever it is. All right, well, let's move into number three, which is avoiding the human side of leadership. And I think one of the biggest surprises for many new managers is how much of leadership involves relationships and human dynamics. Why do you think that aspect of leadership is often underestimated?
It's a great question. I think it's because you just don't know until you're in it. Because again, when you're an individual contributor, you have your task, you have a contained system that you're doing your tasks within. Once you're a manager, you're working through influence, like we talked about earlier. And people don't just react in ways that we think they're going to react. And so we have to kind of, I think a lot of leaders carry the weight of responsibility and they take that home with them and they think about that conversation that they had with their coworker that was tough or that they didn't handle well or that like why can't I get this person to do this? I've made the expectations clear and they're still not doing that. And they try to figure that out mentally, but it also weighs on them emotionally. So I think as leaders and new managers step into that new role, they start to feel the weight of responsibility. They start to feel the weight of how others are reacting. Now, responsibility can be a tricky thing. And when I teach about using conscious leadership tools, we talk about this concept of 100% responsibility. And what that means is it's a discernment, because a lot of times we are taught to take more than our fair share of responsibility. So as a leader, we think I have to take 120% responsibility and I'm in charge of what everybody else is doing. But that ultimately leads to burnout. And then it can also disempower the team, because if the leader is taking on more than their share of responsibility, the rest of the team is taking on less than their 100%. So instead of having a pie that we divide up and it's like, you take this slice and I take this slice and we're dividing it up, we ask in teams, what is my 100% responsibility to take here? And what is your 100% responsibility? So, and those pies, so we have 20 pies if we have a team of 20 rather than one pie. And it's really getting people to step into what is mine to do. Because otherwise we like to judge. We like to be like, well, that person needs to do this better, and we push things away. But when we take responsibility in and we say, what is mine to do? And we're really discerning about, this is mine to do, this is not mine to do. It becomes a game changer with how agreements are made, with how the weight of responsibility is carried, with how things get sequenced. And it can become a really important concept in teams.
Yeah, yeah. What are some of the sort of outcomes when a manager avoids that relational side of leadership? I imagine it's not just poor performance, it could be also people decide to leave and go elsewhere. What are some of those outcomes?
Yeah, I think there's a range of outcomes. I think, like you said, retention could be an issue. If the leader is self-aware, they might be able to see the dynamics happening. Sometimes they're not even self-aware to pick up that it's happening. And
Right.
then you need to figure out what's the feedback loop that's going to help them see what's actually happening. Because again, if they're assuming, oh, I know how so-and-so thinks based on how I think, it's often off. So those outcomes can range from subtle tension in a team, people not speaking up in meetings, people not bringing their full creative power to whatever it is they're doing, collaboration going down, competition going up. You can see all kinds of different dynamics that can happen.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Are there certain things practical ways a new manager can begin to understand what motivates and engages the people on their team?
Mhm. This is again where I'm going to go back to the Enneagram because
Good. Yeah.
it really is the deepest map because the Enneagram looks at why do we do what we do. And usually that motivation is also part of a core fear. So I'll give myself as an example. My type is what's called Enneagram type 3. It's called a competitive achiever. And my core fear is that if I'm not working, I'm not valuable. But that's an unconscious thing. I didn't know that that was my core fear. And I hit a point where I got really burned out. I was working so hard. I had 2 young kids and I had a massive health issue, and was fully exhausted. But I didn't know the underlying thing driving me was my fear that if I stopped working, that I wasn't valuable. That's a really deep thing. And it took me
I
learning
get
the
it.
Enneagram to see, oh, that's why I was burning out. That's why I was getting rewarded at work. I was getting promotions. I was doing great things. And yet I wasn't healthy. I wasn't in balance. I was in strain and burnout. And so the motivation is going to drive us in unconscious ways. And again, that's why I love the Enneagram over all tools, because it makes the unconscious visible. It helps us see this is why this person. So I'll give another example. If you're a type 2, which is the considerate helper, they're very good at seeing what other people need and then stepping in to fill that. But they have a hard time acknowledging what they need. And so a type 2 leader will give and give and give and give. And yet they are really at risk for burnout because they're not attending to their own needs as well. So that's
Yeah.
where, again, you get a precision around what's the underlying motivation. And then the solution becomes based on that person's unique core type.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. So time to jump into number 4.
Great.
And number 4 is filling every minute with meetings and activities, and probably thinking that that's what managers need to do. I think there's that pressure to prove oneself as a new manager, and that could end up filling calendars with meetings and different activities. Why is this such a common pattern?
Yeah. So I think, especially post pandemic, as people are either in hybrid situations or online, if you have a Zoom meeting, if they're back to back to back to back. So some of that is the culture of the organization filling in a lot of meetings, and the manager's thinking, like, well, I just got to step up to what the culture's doing.
Right,
And
right.
so some of it's being asked to join some of those tables and meetings that they weren't in before. So that can be really good. It's like, oh, now I'm in on it and I'm seeing these other dynamics. So the manager wants to say yes to everything often, and as part of that proving thing. And that can be okay until, if you never learn how to say no and to say, hey, I could do this, but it's going to cost this. Or
Yeah.
if I'm like, you start to learn the practice around, what do I say yes to and what do I say no to? And then what can happen is the meetings just get scheduled in unless time is blocked for reflection. And
Mhm.
because those managers need to learn how to get on the balcony and see the system, if they don't have reflective time and space to see the patterns, they're just going to stay on the hamster wheel of those meetings. And then it's just like, what's the next thing? It's like the urgent but not important, to use the Peter Drucker phrase. And so you can get caught in that wheel of urgency and then not build in the time for the important and the things that aren't the fire drills, but they're the things that ultimately are going to strengthen trust, increase communication, help the team operate better. So sometimes I recommend that managers, new managers and all managers, block out time for themselves. It's like, okay, every, Thursday afternoon, for example, I'm going to take from 3 to 5 or from 12 to 2 and literally block it on their calendars. But there's blocking on your calendars, and then it's holding the time when someone says, hey, I need just time. So it's also sometimes learning those boundaries and learning when being the team player is also undermining the overall team performance and team health, and being willing to say it, not in an accusatory way of just saying like, hey, I could be in that meeting, but here's what I'm trading off. And even if their manager's asking for them, being very clear about these are the trade-offs if I make these calls, and learning how to be candid and in saying those things out loud. Because a lot of times I think people think it, but whether they're willing to say it out loud in a productive way that makes decision making more transparent, sometimes that's a skill that has to be learned over time.
That's great. So I think all of my follow-up questions to the original one about filling every minute with meetings and activity have been answered. I was going to ask, like, what's the risks of that constant activity without time for reflection and strategic thinking? And then I was going to ask, how can leaders create space in their schedules to think, plan, and lead more intentionally? And I think you answered both of them really well. Are there any other elements to this particular mistake that we should be aware of?
That's where the value of a retreat can come in. So a lot of times, if you can block weekly or monthly times on your calendar, but sometimes getting the whole team together and having a half day or a full day to in a different setting to talk about whether they're higher level strategic things, whether there are things in the culture going on. Sometimes having an external facilitator come hold the space for those conversations so that the leader can also participate in them rather than having to carry all the conversations as well. Sometimes that becomes a really valuable space that could feel like a luxury. And yet I find the teams that are really focused on, if you want performance, you got to maximize team health as well. So creating these reflective spaces in a quarterly cadence can be really effective.
Love it. Oh, that's great. Okay. So now we're on to mistake number 5. I feel like there's probably 100 mistakes, but the ones we're going to focus on for new managers, and the last one we'll focus on is failing to design how the team works together. And that last mistake that you often discuss is failing to intentionally design how the team operates. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I view the world kind of as when I work with teams, I view it as an architect. I view it as, how do we set this particular system up for success? And that first starts with mapping who are the people on this team, what are their tendencies, what are their strengths, what are their challenges, and then looking at the roles. So really saying, what are the roles that we need in this organization, in our team? And sometimes there's a mismatch between the EOS model will say right person, right seat. So you've got the role or the seat, and it is the right person in the right seat. So sometimes we've got a role or a seat there's a mismatch with someone's natural strengths and abilities. So sometimes there needs to be some recalibration around, is this person's strengths, are those being fully leveraged? And maybe this other role might be better for them. So sometimes it's looking at, do we have the talent, the experience, the temperament? All of those things come into play as we're looking at how are things actually going to happen. And then you start to look at process handoffs of, how does work get done? How does the team that starts something, how does it get finished? And that's again where the Enneagram maps that out beautifully. I'll talk about the connection between 7 and 1. So in the Enneagram symbol, a lot of the numbers are connected. And for example, 7 and 1 are in dynamic tension. So 7 is the enthusiastic visionary. 1 is called the strict perfectionist. What I see a lot of times in teams is the 7 has the vision. They're like, here's what it looks like. Here's what we can do. But they're not always the one to finish. And sometimes they'll get 80% of the way done, but if they're the ones expected to take that to completion, sometimes they'll be like, their own personality structure is going to lead them to want to move on to the next thing and not finish. But the team needs for that thing to be finished. And so then sometimes partnering with a 1 that's the strict perfectionist, that's very good at process, very kind of like black, white in terms of like, these are the standards, these have to be met. And so sometimes having that 7-1 combination, even within 2 people on the team, can help something get done. So that's why seeing the map of how does this team, how are the people on the team oriented based on their Enneagram type? And then what are the roles requiring? And looking at those intentionally really helps to see what are the gaps? Where do we need different talent? Where do we need this person to take more of this? It helps to define more clearly how to take this set of people with these roles.
Love it.
Mhm.
And is it important for new managers to establish clear norms and expectations early in their tenure?
Absolutely. This is a great point. I call this agreements. This comes out of conscious leadership work. The agreements are called who will do what by when. These are relational agreements. We talked about this a little bit earlier. But the cleaner that teams get with agreements, the less drama there is in a team. So and again, these are not like directives where the team leader is like, you need to do this without any type of conversation. This could be a conversation to say, okay, it's important in our team to show up to meetings, let's just say 1 minute before they're scheduled to start or 2 minutes before they're scheduled to start. We're going to create an agreement around when that we're going to show up on time so that we don't waste people's times. We are we're getting things done efficiently, and we're also going to make an agreement that every meeting ends at 10 minutes before the hour, such that so that there is time to go to the restroom, go to like, so you can intentionally set up the mechanics of the day, but also the relational agreements. Because when I worked for Conscious Leadership Group, actually, and I had trained with them in coaching, but then I also was a coach with them. When we would have a meeting on Zoom, we would know that people were just going to be there on time. And if something hadn't happened, we need like, oh, something really must have come up, because we rely on our teammates to keep their agreements. So the amount of drama literally that drops away when those type of clear agreements and expectations around how do we show up with each other, so we respect each other, we respect each other's time. Because I'm sure we've all been in meetings and teams where somebody's 3 minutes late, but I got there 5 minutes early, and now I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm wasting my time. So resentment builds when those agreements aren't clean. So clean
Yeah.
agreements will take care of much of the drama in organizations.
Yeah, good, good, good. And are there certain simple systems that you recommend new managers implement that help kind of build clarity, accountability, and alignment? I often think that they're necessary without it feeling forced, or sometimes, new managers will say stuff, and I think their teams are like, who does this person think they are? They were just one of us a minute ago, and now,
That's true.
now they're trying to pretend like they know all this stuff. So, I mean, just some simple systems, some simple
Mhm.
things that new
Yeah.
managers can do.
There's one model I really like. It's called RACI, and it's defined as who's the R is for responsible, the A is for accountable, the C is for consulted, and the I is for informed. So sometimes when you're looking at a set of decisions, you can say, okay, who's ultimately responsible for this decision? And that might be the CEO or the head of the organization, but who's actually accountable to move that forward might be a team leader, and then who that person consults with about what happens with that decision versus who's informed of the decision after it's made. Getting crystal clear on those things helps to relieve any gray areas, because sometimes people will think, well, I should have been consulted on that, or why did I just, or sometimes people will not get informed of a decision when they needed to be informed. So there are some of those, and there's other workflow tools and processes like EOS, Entrepreneurs Organization. They've got a lot of great ways of
Yeah.
working. So there's so many good ones out there tactically. I think the importance of making things transparent and clear. And when a lot of times people think they don't have time to define those things, but what I see in organizations is the more time you spend intentionally setting that stuff up, the smoother everything else goes. And then it kind of flows like a river rather than hitting boulders that were unexpected along the way.
Good. Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure the process of outlining who's responsible, like using the RACI system, and then maintaining some accountability, checking back in and doing the necessary kind of where are we on all of these things on a regular basis is appropriate too. So I have three last questions. I think they're pretty quick. Um, the first one, if someone listening today was promoted into their first management role very recently, what are maybe the two or three things you believe they should focus on in their first 90 days?
Yeah, I would say self-awareness, listening, and starting to see the team as a system. And there's different ways
Wow.
you can do that. But really, again, inner game runs the outer game. So if the leader doesn't have good self-awareness, and a lot of times having a coach, having someone to help them see that at least at first, sets them up for success. Learning how to listen rather than feel like they need to be the one to speak all the time. And again, there's so many different tools that we can and practices we can do around that. And then starting the practice of getting on the balcony. How can I get on the balcony? How do I see this as a system? Whether you use the tools that I've talked about today, there's many other wonderful tools out there, but knowing that as a leader and as a manager, you've got to start seeing all the pieces as a system.
It's awesome. It's so cool. Okay. In your experience coaching leaders, what do you feel separates managers who grow quickly from those who struggle in leadership roles? Is it
Yeah.
what you just said, or is it something else?
I think it could go back to fixed mindset versus growth mindset. So that's Carol Dweck's research. But really, if someone's in a fixed mindset, they're not learning new things. They're like, this is the way I've always done it, and they don't have an ability to have that neuroplasticity but a growth mindset is like, I don't know this. I'm going to be curious. What do I get to learn? Can I experiment? What can I try? And they're coachable. They will take feedback in, and they can be discerning about that feedback, but they're willing to adjust, pivot, be flexible, learn as they go, incorporate new lessons. I love this quote from Esther Dyson of always make new mistakes. And because if you think about it, like we think that mistakes aren't good, but if we're always making new mistakes, we're learning that next thing. And we're not repeating what we already learned. It's like, hey, did you learn that one or did you not? Because if not, life's going to keep spiraling back around and keep handing you it's like the universe has a tendency to, put a pebble in, it'll be a little bit of ripple. And if you don't get the lesson the first time, then it's like, what's the baseball? And then if you don't get the lesson, what's the boulder? It's gonna,
Yeah.
so reading that earlier before it turns into a boulder.
Yeah. No, so good. So good. Okay. And I hope I'm not asking you to be repetitive here, but for our final question, if listeners remember only one insight from today's conversation about becoming a better manager, what would you want it to be?
I think I'm going to go back to the inner game runs the outer game.
Okay. All right. Well, this
The
is your opportunity to describe that.
I will. Okay. Yeah. So our perception matters so much more than we realize. And a lot of times we don't even see the filters that we're seeing the world through. And the more we have self-awareness, the more we see our own patterns, we see our own triggers that we're willing to grow through those, we show up in the world in ways that reflect back our inner clarity. And I'll take this to an even higher level. Like if we want peace in the world, each of us needs to learn how to cultivate peace within ourselves. We need to deal with the parts of us that are warring. We need to be able to have the space for parts that showed up in an earlier age that haven't been fully incorporated. I really think for our world to be what we want it to be, I would love to see peace on earth. I don't like war. I know that each of our work internally has such an impact on our teams, on our companies, on our communities, and ultimately in the world that we want to create. So for me, even beyond like profit and loss in a company, learning to show up with a regulated nervous system in a way where our leadership presence can change the room rather than not just what we do, but who we are, who we're being, not just what we're doing. That makes all the difference.
Well said. Well, Stephanie, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing so many insights. The transition into leadership is one of the most important moments in a professional career, and your perspective will no doubt help many leaders navigate those early months with greater confidence and effectiveness. And thank you to everyone listening for joining us for the Nonprofit Edge podcast, where, as you know, we explore ideas and expertise that help nonprofit leaders strengthen their organizations and advance their missions. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please like and subscribe. And remember to check out our other podcasts, Lead for Good and Mastering Fundraising, available wherever you listen to podcasts. So until next time, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us for the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and learned some important lessons from our featured expert. We always want our content to be informative and to position nonprofit leaders to succeed. Please join us again for our next podcast. In the meantime, we wish you all the best and encourage you to learn more about Fulcrum Nonprofit Leadership by visiting our website at www.fulcrumleader.com.